History of a Teacher by Famous Fault. Chapter 23. Hysteria. Dumbledore had expected that Severus would show up with something to say about his lessons with Harry. What Snape had to say was, however, nothing close to what Dumbledore had anticipated. Severus stormed into the office without bothering to knock, something out of the ordinary for the man holding the Pensieve. Dumbledore looked up and was about to comment Severus's rather inappropriate entrance when he saw the expression on the face of the former Death Eater.
"Merlin's bed! What happened?"
Dumbledore asked, stood up, and hurried towards Snape. Snape opened his mouth to explain several times, but he wasn't able to form a single word. Never in his life had he seen such memories, and he couldn't understand how Potter had gotten those memories in the first place. Snape wouldn't say he hadn't enjoyed watching the bulldog chase the student into a tree, but the rest of those memories... No, they weren't the least enjoyable. What confused Snape most was that Potter had been equally shocked by the memories Snape had discovered. The teen had been thoroughly shaken and close to a breakdown. Snape wondered slightly what Potter was up to now.
"Severus, sit down!"
Dumbledore commanded from far away.
"Drink some water."
The headmaster handed him a glass. Severus drank as if his life depended on it. He drained the glass in a couple of seconds and received a new glass, which he drank equally fast. Then he put the second glass on one of the spindly-legged tables he had gathered himself. Severus was not the one to be overwhelmed by panic for long. In fact, he thrived when everyone else panicked.
"Dumbledore,"
Snape said, his voice indicating that he had retrieved his calm self.
"I don't know what happened, but you should know about it anyway. I think it's best just to watch it."
With those words, he lifted his wand to his head and put a memory in the Pensieve. Dumbledore frowned, but did not question Severus's request. Instead, they bent over, first Dumbledore, then Severus, and were sucked into the fresh memory. Dumbledore landed in Severus's office, next to the Severus in the corner of the room. Professor Muto was standing in the doorway, oblivious to the two spectators of the scene. For some reason, Dumbledore knew that if the spirit possessing the teacher would have addressed him, he wouldn't even have been surprised. But then again, it was a memory, so there was technically speaking no chance that something like that would happen.
"Professor Dumbledore requested me to come," the young man said, and closed the door behind him.
"Yes, so he told me," Severus said, and sounded slightly hostile. Professor Muto didn't react on his colleague's tone. Instead, he looked around, clearly intrigued by the things he saw. It was in moments like those that Dumbledore wished he could see the wizarding world from an outsider's point of view, too. The wonder and curiosity in their eyes was unmatched by anything else Dumbledore knew.
"What exactly does he want you to do?"
Memory, Severus asked the Japanese, hiding his curiosity with more hostility.
"You two get along well," Dumbledore remarked, and received a snort as reply from the dark-haired man next to him.
"Only the impossible," Professor Muto said with a smile as he walked to a shelf and let his eyes trail over the glass jars with slimy bits of animals. "But I'm going to try anyway." When Professor Muto reached the end of the shelf and was shrouded by the darkness in the corner of the room, a person knocked on the door. Harry came in carefully and clearly did not notice the history teacher in the dark corner of the room as he shut the door behind him.
"Well, Potter, you know why you were here,"
Memory, Severus said, while Dumbledore listened attentively.
"Although a slight adjustment has been made since our last meeting, Professor Muto will now be assisting us under our sessions."
"What?" Harry called out in a way that amused the headmaster. From the dark corner in which Professor Muto had been standing, a small figure entered the light, and Dumbledore noticed how short the Japanese actually was. The intimidating and aggressive attitude he had towards Dumbledore made that the headmaster never had really seen it before. "I told the headmaster not to expect too much from me, but I'll do my best," Professor Muto said, with his back turned towards the two observers.
"The headmaster has asked me to teach you occlumency. I can only hope that you prove more adept at it than at potions," Memory, Severus said, on which Dumbledore commented, "You know positive motivation is proven to work better than negative motivation."
"Not for me," Severus said dryly, watching the scene closely.
"Right," Memory, Harry said tersely.
"This might not be an ordinary class, Potter," Severus said, and his eyes narrowed malevolently.
"But I am still your teacher, and you will therefore call me Sir or Professor at all times."
"Yes, sir," Harry said, and Dumbledore noticed the passive annoyance in the student's voice. Dumbledore didn't comment on the things he saw, although his attention was at its very pitch when Professor Muto began explaining. "Tell me, were you conscious of your body when your mind entered that of the snake?" Harry shook his head and Dumbledore leaned forward. He wished he could take notes.
"No, I was asleep."
Professor Muto was still standing with his back towards the two observers, and when he took some steps towards Harry, Dumbledore followed so he wouldn't miss a word.
I didn't think so. However, you weren't asleep. When your mind leaves your body falls into a state that can be compared to sleeping, but you are awake. The danger with going into someone's mind is that you have to leave your own body. Now, your mind will be back in less than a split second if someone would harm your physical body, and that's why people don't see it that way. Only the conscious parts of your mind are transferred into that of the other person, because you still have a need of a breathing body, and something has to keep you breathing. But you understand my point? Harry nodded. I think so.
This is fascinating, Dumbledore breathed. Though this couldn't be what shook you so much, can it?
Severus shook his head. No, it was not. Although even this was quite morbid. Now, Voldemort, Professor Muto started, only to be interrupted by Severus. Don't speak his name, he hissed. I will speak his name. Professor Muto said, turned around and looked Memory Severus in the eye. There is only one living creature in this world who I despise more than Voldemort, and that's why I will speak his name whenever I feel the need.
Do you know who he's talking about?
Dumbledore asked Severus, his gaze fixed on the bat-like man. Is he talking about Lucius Malfoy? Severus suggested quietly. It would hardly surprise the potion master if that was the case.
I believe so,
The headmaster confirmed with a sober expression.
He is even more of a tortured soul than I thought to begin with. Tell me, Severus, do you dislike him like you wanted to?
Severus shook his head. No, at least I didn't until this. No, I don't know. With those cryptic words, he went silent and turned his concentration back on the man they had been talking about. All right, Voldemort is not aware of the danger that hides in leaving his own body. The reason he is not aware of that is because most people only think about protecting themselves and never considered harming him while he invades their mind.
That's genius!
Dumbledore called out, almost sounding like a little girl, confirming what Percy had said 4 years ago, that indeed Dumbledore was slightly mad.
It's a surprise. I've never thought of that.
Are you suggesting that you can harm a person's mind inside your own? Memory Severus asked, and the disgusted and horrified expression on his past and present self were identical. Professor Muto shook his head, somewhat to Dumbledore's disappointment. No, you can't harm a person in one's mind. You can, however, trap a person in your own soul. If you dare. Impossible! Severus spat, enraged, while the present him shook his head. Dumbledore was beyond words, and didn't comment anymore. Instead, he sat down in the chair behind Severus's desk, and listened, fascinated. Not quite, Professor Muto said with another faint smile. Picture your soul as a room. The inside of that room mirrors who you are as a person. It contains memories, things that really bother you, often unconscious. If you have access to a person's soul, you can get to know them as well as you know yourself. People who are in deep shock tend to withdraw to their soul's room and stay there, unreachable for the outside world. Like every room, it has a door, and outside that door, there is a hallway. The harder it is to reach that person's soul, the longer the hallway. The way that room looks changes with time, just like you do yourself. That sounds as if you've been there, Harry said and cocked his head. Dumbledore had to agree, but then again, no one else but Dumbledore knew that Yugimoto, on occasion, was forced to that place by the spirit of the puzzle. Although Dumbledore had assumed that Yugi would be forced to the outskirts of his mind, not to his soul. At least now he knew what the two doors had been when he tried to invade the teacher's mind. I've been in my own, Professor Muto said quietly, and Dumbledore snorted. Severus looked at his employer, but did not comment. Have you ever seen your own? The Japanese asked the student. Harry shook his head. Not that I know of. That's a disadvantage, the young man sighed. Dumbledore is aware of the possibility to lock someone away within your soul's room, although he does not master it himself. He hopes I can teach you to do so. Did you? Severus wondered, and Dumbledore nodded.
Yes, I do.
Why didn't you master it? Severus wondered, knowing the headmaster's thirst for skill and ability.
I only learned about it recently from the very man you see standing before you. I never considered asking him to teach me. In addition to that, I'm not sure if I really want to.
Then how do you lock someone away? Harry wondered curiously, while Memory Severus still was comprehending what Professor Muto had said.
I wish I could write this all down,
Dumbledore sighed. You can keep the memory. I have little desire of it, Severus said, with a voice filled with bitterness. He could tell Dumbledore was pleased, but also troubled by those words. To be able to do that requires a thorough insight in how your room looks like, how large it is, and where the dark corners are. When you know it that well, you can start securing it against intruders, mainly by putting up traps. You should see an invading mind as a miniature version of that person. It can simplify things. Now, if the intruder walks into the trap you created and you did it with some sort of skill, then that person will be unable to leave. Ever. Like Severus said, the mind is a many-layered thing. So is your soul. That room is only the summary, filled with symbolic objects to represent your core. Such a trap expels an invader to your deepest layer, and they won't be able to take themselves away from there, in addition to the fact that they'll be harmless. In your soul's room, you have the advantage. In your mind, you do not. In your mind, you're at the mercy of the legitimist.
How do you know this?
Memory Severus asked rather unfriendly.
Aren't you a muggle? Even though you might not dislike him like you wanted to, at least Professor Muto thinks that you do,
Dumbledore remarked, then sighed.
Though I guess it's crucial for you to treat him that way if our plans want to succeed.
Severus just made a disapproving sound. Then we come to the second part that is crucial to mastering this technique, Professor Muto said while he, to Dumbledore's delight, ignored Severus. This isn't part of any wizarding magic. This is far older and should have been long forgotten. What exactly are you going to teach me? Harry wondered, and Dumbledore noticed the distrust. He wondered if it was a good or bad thing. Professor Muto noticed it too. The headmaster was sure of it, but he didn't react on that either. Probably nothing. It craves a whole lot of discipline to be able to place traps in your own soul. Occlumency is your priority. If it shows you are talented in occlumency, I'm going to try to teach you how to reach your own soul. Let me warn you. Today there is only one person in this world who is able to trap invaders in his soul. The likeliness of you being able to learn it is close to zero. You see, it's not magic, it's pure willpower. Even Muggles could do it if anyone was strong, brave, and disciplined enough for it. You must realize that facing your inner self is among the most frightening things to do. To Dumbledore, that was something like a slap in the face. His own soul room was a mystery to him. Despite that he was certain that he wouldn't enjoy seeing it, he was afraid to find something that wasn't quite consistent with the way he thought of himself, or most importantly, something that did fit in with his own thoughts of himself. Ariana. He was sure she'd be all over the place. He shook his head to lose the thoughts, but couldn't get rid of the unpleasant feeling that had a hold of him.
I doubt that Potter will have the ability to learn something like that,
Severus said, scornful, and Harry glared at him. Memory Severus drew his wand from the inside pocket and raised it as Harry tensed. Severus put it against his head and drew out a silvery white substance that neatly fell into the basin on the desk. Dumbledore noticed that the present-day Severus next to him tensed too. Whatever Severus wanted to show the headmaster, it would come soon.
Stand up and take out your wand, Potter.
Memory Severus commanded.
You may use your wand to attempt to disarm me or defend yourself in any way you can think of. And what are you going to do?
I am about to break into your mind, Severus said softly. We are going to see how well you can resist. I have been told you have already shown aptitude at resisting the Imperius Curse. You will find that similar powers are needed for this. Brace yourself, now. Look closely. I do not know how this will appear to us, Severus said. He had never been in the memory of someone performing legilimens, and it would have been very interesting to see, hadn't his discoveries been so gruesome.
I have seen something like this. We will be transported into what you saw, though we'll see it the way you saw it and not the way it was. It does tend to suffice,
Dumbledore assured the teacher. Suddenly, the two of them were standing in Little Winging, and Harry's cousin was riding a red bike with a huge smile, while Harry was looking on with an odd expression on his face. They were both very young, 5 or so. Less than a second later, they were standing in the garden. Harry, only slightly younger than when he entered Hogwarts, was running as if his life depended on it and climbed into a tree with surprising agility. Dumbledore couldn't help but wonder why until a bulldog ran through his incorporeal body. Next to Severus and the headmaster, the Dursleys were laughing. Both scenes were bright, a sign that Severus had enjoyed watching them. Then the scene went dark. Ministry fears Black is rallying point for old Death Eaters. The Ministry of Magic announced late last night that there has been a mass breakout from Azkaban. Speaking to reporters in his private office, Cornelius Fudge, Minister for Magic, confirmed that 10 high-security prisoners escaped in the early hours of yesterday evening, and that he has already informed the Muggle Prime Minister of the dangerous nature of these individuals.
We find ourselves most unfortunately in the same position we were 2.5 years ago when the murderer Sirius Black escaped, said Fudge last night. Nor do we think the two breakouts are unrelated. An escape of this magnitude suggests outside help. And we must remember that Black, as the first person ever to break out of Azkaban, would be ideally placed to help others follow in his footsteps. We think it likely that these individuals, who include Black's cousin, Bellatrix Lestrange, have rallied around Black as their leader. We are, however, doing all we can to round up the criminals, and we beg the magical community to remain alert and cautious. On no account should any of these individuals be approached.
Yugi ripped the paper in two and threw the shreds of it into the fire. It was a nice way to start a new day. That Tuesday morning, Yugi hadn't bothered joining the other teachers for breakfast in the Great Hall. Instead, he had asked Dobby for some breakfast. The last thing he wanted was to be confronted by either Snape or Dumbledore. Yugi was convinced that Snape had talked to the headmaster. It would have been the logical choice, considering the situation. Yugi hadn't required anything more but their reactions to know what they had seen. He had just slipped to the ground when he realized what had happened. Snape hadn't bothered about him, but just stormed out of his office. After half an hour or so, Yugi had gathered himself and left. Atem had spent the rest of the evening lost in thought, and had occasionally started shaking. The spirit's own PTSD was driving them both insane. Atem had tried to gather himself several times, but every time he had just fallen back into thoughts. Yugi had asked Atem to tell him, but the former pharaoh had refused. He would under no circumstance tell Yugi exactly what had happened that one atrocious hour. Yugi had no need of more nightmares than he already had. The result was that both Atem and Yugi had a poor night. That morning, Yugi was as tired as he had been the night before, and he did not look forward to starting class that morning, especially not since the first class he had included Rebecca. She'd noticed at once that something was wrong, and knowing the blonde, she wouldn't give up until he had told her what it was that troubled him. Neither Yugi's nor Atem's day was brightened by the front page of the Daily Prophet. And the fact that Voldemort had retrieved 10 of his Death Eaters hardly made things better for them. Antonin Dolohov, Augustus Rookwood, Bellatrix Lestrange, all of them ruthless killers who had now escaped, free to kill whoever they wanted again. Yugi couldn't help but think about the faces of his friends who had been murdered by this gang. Indirectly, perhaps, but Lucius Malfoy was one of them, and thus these murderers were as bad as Lucius was. All these names, all the blood they had on their hands, among those, Joey's, Tea's, and Tristan's. Yugi's eyes narrowed. He'd get his revenge. He just had to wait for the right opportunity. This morning, they had come one step closer to a war, and as soon as that war started, he'd make his next move. The only problem was Rebecca. Yugi wouldn't forgive himself if something happened to her. He had lost too many friends already. He had counted on being able to act alone, but Rebecca tied him to Hogwarts. He sighed and walked towards the window. Staring at the snow-covered grounds, he whispered, "Lucius Malfoy will die, one way or another." Atem watched his lighter silently. He too wanted revenge, but it was saddening to see Yugi like this, even 4.5 years later. Then something came Yugi to mind. "Sirius Black, the most wanted man in Britain," he said suddenly.
Yeah, Atem said. That's what Rebecca told us.
Yugi nodded. "Yes, indeed, but Rebecca had her suspicion on the prophet's words not being entirely true. In fact, I think she thinks it's a cover-up." Ginny Weasley reacted when Peeves stated that he's the worst mass murderer of all time. What do you think about Sirius Black?
Atem was grateful for the change of topic and grabbed onto it with both hands. I don't know. Though I think Ginny is trustworthy. What do you know about the Weasleys? What they are like could make a great factor in my judgment on Sirius Black. If they were Death Eaters, then I suppose it doesn't really matter.
Not much more about them as about any other family. Apparently, Mr. Weasley worked on the Ministry and was attacked during a night shift. Rebecca said, however, that all the Weasleys are in the DA, something that, for me, speaks in their favor.
But you don't believe the prophet?
Atem asked. Yugi shook his head and dug his hands in his pockets as he strolled away from the window. "No, I'm not convinced. The Ministry refuses to admit that Lord Voldemort is back, and they probably just use Black as a cover-up. I wouldn't know if what he's convicted for is accurate or not, though. We can only speculate, and right here and now, speculations are useless." Atem nodded.
I suppose so. I, too, don't know what to think about this article, or Black himself.
When Rebecca entered the history classroom, she and most of the other students received a shock. The door towards Professor Muto's office was gone, and so was the door from the office to his room. Rebecca was quite certain that the door from Yugi's room to the hallway was gone too, as she had a suspicion to why the doors had vanished. When they all sat on their respective place, Ginny raised a hand. "Professor, sorry for asking, but what happened to the duels?" Yugi blushed in a way Rebecca rarely saw him do nowadays, but which had been quite common before. He put a hand on his head and sort of shrunk, making him even shorter than he already was. I lost my key, and the doors won't open without it, he confessed. Rebecca blinked, and for a second the entire room was silent. Then they all burst out laughing until they cried. That was something Yugi hadn't taken into account when giving up his deck. Yugi blushed even more. As soon as I find some blankets, I'm going to hang them where the doors were previously. I appreciate if you couldn't make too much fun of me. Our lips are sealed, Professor, a Gryffindor said, and the effect was some more laughing. Yugi straightened himself and retrieved his serious expression. Now it was time to learn. But Rebecca could tell that he didn't really have to focus on the lecture, and eventually he just gave up. Something very unlike Yugi. When less than half of the time had passed, he dismissed them. Rebecca knew that the students blamed it on the death of her grandfather, that Yugi was so out of it, but she knew that something more was going on. When she packed her things slowly, Yugi shook his head and made a gesture towards the door. Clearly, she was being dismissed. She scowled, but did not protest. Instead, she joined Peter, Ginny, and Luna as they left the classroom. Having been focusing on Yugi more than on Ginny, Rebecca didn't notice that the Gryffindor was acting slightly strange. "What's wrong?" she asked the redhead quietly, so she wouldn't attract the attention of Peter and Luna, who were discussing loudly in front of them about something Rebecca couldn't even pronounce. "Nothing," Ginny said, a smile snapping into place. "How so?" "Because you look so thoughtful," Rebecca said, and looked Ginny in the eye. "Is something wrong?" Ginny shook her head, and the fake smile stayed in place. "What should be wrong?" "You are a terrible liar." Rebecca sighed and pulled her little red bag, which contained her cards, back into place. "Well, you won't ever tell me what's in that red bag of yours. It's so red that it's impossible to miss, and you never let go of it. But you won't ever tell what's in it," Ginny retorted, trying the offensive rather than the defensive. "All memories," Rebecca said silently. "But then again, I don't lie about its content. I just don't tell you. You are the one lying." "Fine, I just don't want to tell you," Ginny said and took a turn, heading to the Gryffindor common room. During her biology class, Ginny didn't talk to Rebecca and was in an unusual dark mood. So were many of the other Gryffindors, Luna pointed out when they left the class. Luna, Peter, and Rebecca kept exchanging theories on why the Gryffindors were behaving so oddly, but none of them could find anything that brought the mood down this much. Surely the mood in the entire school had been low, and only Rebecca knew that it was very much due to Yugi. But she couldn't connect the recent circumstances to her old friend now. Overnight, the mood of the Gryffindors had faltered to an immense degree, and it was almost as if they were waiting for something. "It feels a bit like my first year," Luna said dreamily, as if she was looking back at a period she missed, "when the basilisk was loose and tried to kill the students." Peter shuddered. "Now that was a scary period! And then your first year? Couldn't have been worse! Especially for those like me!" "Now hold on a minute," Rebecca said, annoyed. "Stop talking in riddles and tell me what happened." 4 years ago, a basilisk was loose in the school's pipe system. The basilisk was hidden in his secret chamber in the school by Salazar Slytherin, so it would keep the school pure, Luna said with a smile Rebecca found inappropriate, although she was used to it. "Pure?" she wondered. Peter nodded with a grave expression. Salazar Slytherin's opinion was that only pure-blood wizards and witches should be allowed to enter the school. But the other founders disagreed, and even half-bloods and muggle-borns were allowed into the school. Salazar Slytherin was furious and entrusted his heir with the possibility of opening the Chamber of Secrets and unleash the basilisk on the school. That basilisk would kill each and every muggle-born it could find simply by looking a person in the eyes. Luckily enough, no one died, but it was close. And his peak, a student, was taken into the chamber. Who? Rebecca wondered. This was something completely new to her. She guessed it was one of the reasons why the Ministry thought the standards at Hogwarts were falling. "Ginny Weasley," Luna said calmly. "Harry saved her, though. He can speak Parseltongue, so he can get himself into the chamber." "Parseltongue?" Rebecca wondered, still shocked by the news. "Yeah, the language stinks. You know who could speak it too, and so did Salazar Slytherin. That's why many thought it was Harry who commanded the basilisk, but it was not. Let's just put it this way. What they could hide from the students, they kept hidden." Peter said, slightly grumpy. "We never found out what happened. Not really."
Then what do you mean by things feeling the way they did your first year?
Rebecca pushed on.
What's the similarities? For surely there is no basilisk roaming the pipes now.
Luna shook her head.
If it did, we would have known. Although they told us it was killed. When the basilisk attacked students, it failed to kill. Someone saw him through a camera. Someone looked through a mirror. Someone in its reflection in a pool of water. And someone even saw him through a ghost. Those people didn't die but were turned to stone. They were cured with mandrake root, but still, students were turned to stone one by one. And for all of them, it had been plain luck that they didn't die. The fear was constant, and everything was falling apart. Now things are also falling apart too, for better or for worse.
I see, Rebecca whispered.
For better or for worse.
We're simply scared, Peter said. And now something fell apart among the Gryffindors. Whatever it is shook them pretty badly.
There is only one person we can ask. Luckily enough, that person is walking behind us,
Rebecca stated with low voice. Naturally, that caused Peter to look behind him, and Rebecca buried her face in her hands.
Could you be more obvious?
Colin was walking behind them, facing the floor. His camera, which he always had with him, was hanging loosely at his side. He had an unnatural, sober look over him.
Colin?
Rebecca said with a soft voice, and a Gryffindor looked up.
What's going on? Why is everyone so gloomy?
It's Harry,
he whispered.
something is wrong with him.
What do you mean with wrong? Peter wondered, alarmed.
Last night, he returned to the common room in shock. He wouldn't tell anyone what happened. Ron and Hermione were in the library at the time, and Katie Bell went to get them. Harry had gone into his dorm, and although Dean and Neville followed after him, he wouldn't talk to them. When Dean suggested that they go to the hospital, when Harry protested and told them that Madame Pomfrey couldn't possibly do anything to help him. When Hermione and Ron came, they sent everyone out of the dorm, something Dean had already started doing before they arrived. According to Seamus, all Harry did all night was sit on his bed and stare. He hadn't slept at all, and he refused to leave his position for breakfast,
Colin told him. Then, before they could ask anything else, he walked away from them. So that's why Ginny's been acting strange all day, Peter concluded. I wonder what happened. The fifth years have been acting strange for quite a while now. You both remember that Monday on which half of the first-year Gryffindors and Slytherins ended up in the hospital wing. I wonder if it is connected. Realization dawned upon Rebecca. Of course the two were connected. Why would Yugi otherwise have been acting so strangely? Though according to Atem, none of the students would have been able to consciously remember what had happened to them. Has something changed that? After lunch, Hermione and Ron made their way up to the dorm, only to find Harry still sitting there. He hadn't even reacted on the fact that the prophet was blaming his godfather for the mass breakout from Azkaban. Hermione had, on Harry's request, not told Dumbledore about anything, and so had the rest of the Gryffindors. None of them had informed a single teacher about Harry's worrisome condition. Naturally, every teacher had asked, but they had just been silent and refused to answer the teacher's questions. Their friend hadn't said a thing since last night, and then he had just told them that no one should know. He didn't specify anything. He just kept repeating, no one should know. It wasn't hard for Ron and Hermione to figure out that something had gone wrong when Harry was with Snape to learn occlumency, but no matter how often they asked, Harry wouldn't answer a single of their questions. After they had accompanied their friend the entire lunch break, the two left for care of magical creatures. Hermione had barely made it out of the common room before she started sobbing uncontrollably on Ron's shoulder. The tall teen wasn't quite comfortable with that, since he was uncertain what to do, but simply held Hermione until she was done crying. We'll solve this, Hermione, he whispered. No matter what happens, we will solve this. Hermione nodded and gave some sort of smile through her tears.
First, let's go to class. Hagrid will wonder if we don't show up.
Umbridge hadn't changed a bit. Now that Hagrid was on probation, she was present at every single one of Hagrid and Trelawney's lessons. She was just as horrible as she had been before. Professor Mudro had told them that what he had done could have been the most important turnpike in her life. It hadn't been. When Hagrid started the class and Harry hadn't shown up, Umbridge directly started questioning everyone on Harry's whereabouts. The Gryffindors were silent as the grave, and not even Malfoy made stupid comments on Harry's sudden disappearance. Umbridge soon became angry with them, but there was little she could do about their silence. Instead, she just made many notes on her clipboard and glared at them.
After dinner, Hermione waited an hour or so, then told Ron and Harry good night, and left the boys' dorm. Harry had only said one sentence in that entire time. "Don't you remember?" It had been directly aimed at Ron and Hermione, and it had been the last drop for her. She had to know what had happened. Thus, instead of going to bed, as she'd told Ron, she slipped out of the common room. It wasn't after hours yet, but most of the school was deserted anyway. Everyone was either in their common rooms or in the library. Thus, Hermione made her way to Snape's office unseen. She knocked with an unusual amount of force without stopping until Snape yelled at her to come in. He was surprised, to say the least, to see Hermione Granger standing in his office. Her expression was a mixture of fear, anger, and despair, and Snape knew why she was there. Nonetheless, he waited until the Gryffindor spoke. "What the hell happened here last night?" she asked with tears in her voice. Snape closed his eyes. He could be unfriendly to her, as he always was, but for this once, he didn't really feel like that. Snape had only once in his life seen something more shocking than the memories that the boy he had sworn to protect. He considered Dumbledore's words and thought for a very long time before he answered. "What happened was something neither I nor Potter expected. An unforeseen complication, because, like this, there is no possibility for Potter to learn what he's supposed to learn."
That's no answer, Hermione spat. Harry's in a heavy shock since last night, and he hasn't improved at all. He asked me if I didn't remember. Remember what? I know he was here to learn occlumency, so what is it he remembers that terrified him to that point?
I've never seen such horrible memories before. They weren't supposed to be there. They are not natural. I have no idea what they are, but considering their content, it is not surprising that Potter is in a certain need of psychological counseling. Snape said, rather uncaring, but Hermione looked him straight in the eyes and he sighed. Even I was shocked after seeing them.
What do you mean with they are not natural, sir? She asked.
I believe with that answer, you shouldn't be here. You were in his memories, you should have them too, Snape said, as if he had just received a brilliant idea.
I don't know, sir. I have no memories which I could call traumatic, Hermione said, uncertain about where this was heading.
Snape nodded. Yes, I know. That very same thing counted for Potter. He didn't recall those memories first, after I pulled them from his unconscious. Perhaps you two have forgotten them.
In that case, I'd like to know them, Hermione said with a distant tone, searching her memory.
Do you really? You've seen what they did to Potter. Do you think he could stand it? Snape wondered, skeptical.
Hermione shrugged. They would explain things that I don't understand. Things I've been wondering about for a long time now. The consequences I'll just have to deal with.
Don't you want to know more first? Snape wondered.
Anything you can tell me, sir? I just hadn't expected you to say a thing, Hermione answered bluntly.
Dumbledore and I think they have something to do with the behavior of the fifth-year Gryffindors and Slytherins. According to Professor McGonagall and Flitwick, that odd behavior started a couple more months ago after a particular class. A class taught by Professor Muto. I wonder, do you know which one I mean?
Hermione just nodded. She both did and didn't remember the lecture he had given them that day. It was vague, and something was wrong about it. She knew that everyone had changed that day, and not just a little either. Neville was braver, Dean was more helpful, Parvati wasn't as shallow any longer, and Lavender less self-absorbed. The Slytherins had changed too. Malfoy was less condescending, and Tracy had grown more self-assured. The changes had been radical, but somehow they had just passed by for Hermione. She wondered how she'd changed.
I thought so, Snape said with a grim expression. What I suspected was confirmed by Potter's memories. Muto is part of whatever those memories are, most likely the reason they came to exist at all. Taking into account what happened to Umbridge, I can conclude that Professor Muto might quite possibly be dangerous to the students, the teachers, and the entire school.
How did you know Professor Muto was involved in what happened to Umbridge? Hermione wondered, shocked. Had someone leaked the information?
You did, just now, Snape said with a rather pleased smile, and Hermione's eyes narrowed. Don't worry, though. Dumbledore talked to Yugimoto before Christmas already, and he willingly confessed that he was the reason to Umbridge's condition, although he refused to say exactly what happened. You know that, though, don't you?
She got what she deserved, Hermione bit back, more mad at herself than at Snape.
I'm sure she did,
Snape said quietly. He didn't like the pink-clad woman either, and had been quite pleased to see her being carried into the castle in a state of complete hysteria.
I'm also sure you know that there is more to Professor Muto than meets the eye.
Snape didn't require anything else than the Gryffindor's reaction to see that he had hit bullseye.
Dumbledore informed me that there was a certain power in the young man who so desperately seeks revenge.
I wonder how much the professor told you.
He told me about his friends who were killed by a Death Eater, and that he came here because Dumbledore was afraid that he'd get killed if that Death Eater found out he was being hunted.
Hermione said quickly, slightly too quickly. Snape nodded. You and Dumbledore both know something that you're not telling me. It does, however, not matter. If it did, Dumbledore would have told me. Has Potter told you that Professor Muto is supposed to teach him a special sort of defense against Legilimens?
Hermione shook her head fiercely. That shouldn't be possible.
Yes, that's what I thought. Although I think trying to teach someone occlumency when they have such a damaged mind seems rather pointless. He must master his emotions first, and I doubt that he's going to come within 10 meters from Professor Muto anytime soon, considering the things that man has done to Potter, and perhaps all of the students in that particular class.
What about you, sir? What's your opinion on Professor Muto?
Hermione asked boldly, having never felt like this before in Snape's presence. Usually she found Snape unfair and somewhat mean, but now she didn't feel any of these negative feelings towards him. I don't know, Snape said, and retrieved his condescending mask. Was there anything else you wanted to know, Miss Granger?
I just came here to find out what happened to Harry, she said, troubled about what she had heard. It was indeed true that something odd had happened during that class. She had never reflected over it, but it was true.
She just didn't know what it was.
Professor, if there are memories in my head which I can't recall, I'd wish to change that.
Are you asking me to help you retrieve those memories? Snape asked, hiding his admiration for the Gryffindor's courage.
If it's not too much trouble, yes, please,
Hermione whispered. It's done in a matter of seconds, but there is a good chance you'll become hysteric. I will not take responsibility for your choice, he said in his usual emotionless tone.
Give me a second,
Hermione said, and started writing down everything she thought she would need. Everything Professor Muto had told her about himself and the Pharaoh, about the monsters, what had happened to Umbridge and Harry, her conversation with Snape just now, and wrote it down in a way that she hoped would help her through a possible hysteria. She already felt sorry for Ron, but she reminded herself that this could be essential to the great riddle. When she was done, she put the parchment in her pocket and held her hand there.
I'm ready, she said. I want to know if I've got such memories too.
Snape sighed. He really didn't want to see something like that for the second time. He took out his wand and gave the student a couple of seconds to rethink, but she just waited for him. In the back of his mind, Snape wondered what Dumbledore would say when he found out, even though there was no rule that forbade teachers to help students find their hidden memories. Legilimens, Snape said with the determination required, but with little conviction. The stream of images came instantly. Hermione saw herself, 5 years old, on skies, desperately trying to get up after falling. She failed time after time, and her 5-year-old self started crying. 7 years old, at her grandmother's house, baking cookies together. A train with barbed wire as windows. A little kid outside yelling at them that they'd be burned. The wagon filled with skinny women, freezing too much to be able to speak a word. The floor was covered with quicklime, burning her feet. 2 long lines, one consisting of women and children, one of men. She reached the end, and the man in front of her pointed at right. She didn't move, frightened as she was. He hit her full in the face. "Richt!" He yelled, "Richt!" She went right. A dressing room. A child was covering his eyes and was crying uncontrollably, not wanting to take his clothes off. Hermione saw the soldier coming, holding his gun already. She went to the little boy and talked to him, pleading him to take his clothes off, telling him it would be fine. A congested room, people pushed together, several hundred in that little room. Pellets were dropped through a slot in the wall. People started screaming. Then she saw none other than Professor Muto in inmate clothing as he methodically lifted a dead girl from among the labor workers and put her on one of the piles with other dead inmates. His expression gave away that he, under no circumstances, enjoyed what he was doing. Gently, he put her down and closed her eyes. The images seemed to never end. One was more horrid than the other. Most of all, Hermione wanted it to stop. But at the same time, she knew that this could be important. She was just far too terrified by what she saw to remember why. She vaguely noticed that she had started hyperventilating, and when she started screaming, Snape stopped. With her hands over her face, she fell to her knees. "This is not possible," she whispered. "It shouldn't be possible. Everyone was there. Harry, Ron, Neville, Dean, Tracy. Everyone." Snape just stared coolly at the Gryffindor in front of him. I suggest you leave for your dorm now. Perhaps I should remind you of the note you wrote.
With that, he turned away and walked towards his desk. Slowly, Hermione got up, still in complete and utter shock. She had told herself she wouldn't become hysteric, as she had known that she'd see something awful. But this had surpassed everything she had expected. Professor Muto, she thought. He's the key to all of this. He'll have all the answers.